You bought a flowering plant that exploded with color the first year. Blooms everywhere. Neighbors stopped to ask what it was. Then the next season arrived. The leaves came back thick and green and healthy, and you waited and waited. Not a single flower ever showed up. If that story sounds painfully familiar, you are not alone, and you did not necessarily do anything wrong. This is one of the most common mysteries in gardening, and almost every gardener runs into it at least once. The good news is that the real reason is usually simple, fixable, and often has nothing to do with a black thumb. In the next few minutes, we are going to walk through the actual reasons flowers stop blooming after that first spectacular season, and exactly what to do about each one. Some of these causes are well known. A few of them, especially near the end, surprise even gardeners who have been growing flowers for decades. Here is the story most people tell themselves. They assume they killed the plant, or that the nursery sold them a dud, or that their soil is somehow cursed. None of that is usually true. In the vast majority of cases, a healthy, leafy plant that refuses to flower again is simply reacting to one or two small conditions that are easy to overlook and just as easy to correct. Flowers not blooming is one of the most searched gardening frustrations out there, and for good reason. A plant that blooms once and then goes silent feels like a personal failure, even though it almost never is. Once you understand what is actually happening underground, in the sunlight, and in the pruning shears, the mystery usually solves itself. Before we get into the reasons, I want to hear from you. Which flower bloomed beautifully for you once and then never bloomed again? Drop it in the comments, because I guarantee someone else watching had the exact same plant do the exact same thing. If you are new to this channel, welcome. I'm so glad you found us. This channel is dedicated to bringing you honest, fascinating, and genuinely useful content about flowers, gardens, and the incredible world of plants. If you find this kind of content interesting, please go ahead and hit that like button right now. It helps this video reach more people who love plants just as much as we do, and make sure you subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss a new video. We post every week, and there is always something worth watching. We are going to cover more than a dozen reasons flowering plants stop reblooming, from the obvious to the almost nobody talks about. Stick around until the end, because some of the most overlooked causes, the ones that trip up even experienced gardeners, are saved for last. Reason 12. Pruning at the wrong time. Picture this. It is a warm afternoon in early spring. The yard is finally looking tidy again, and you decide to give your hydrangea a good haircut while you are out there with the shears. It feels productive. It feels responsible. And for certain hydrangeas, it is the single fastest way to guarantee a flowerless summer. Here is why. Many popular flowering shrubs, including big leaf hydrangeas, lilacs, and many climbing roses, set their flower buds on old wood, meaning the stems that grew the previous year. Cut those stems back in late winter or early spring, and you are removing the very buds that were about to become this year's flowers. The plant is not damaged, it simply has nothing left to bloom from. Other plants work the opposite way. Panicle hydrangeas, many roses, and butterfly bush bloom on new wood, meaning the growth that emerges in the current season, so pruning them in early spring actually encourages more flowers rather than fewer. This is why the exact same pruning schedule can help one plant and ruin another. The fix is simply knowing which category your plant falls into and timing your cuts accordingly. Old wood bloomers should be pruned right after they finish flowering, never in fall or early spring. New wood bloomers can be pruned in late winter before growth starts. If you already made the cut at the wrong time, do not panic. The plant typically recovers fully and blooms normally again the following year, since you are only losing one season, not the plant itself. A common myth here is that pruning harder always produces more flowers. In reality, the timing matters far more than the intensity. A light trim at the wrong moment can cost you every bloom, while a well-timed cut on the right plant can double your flower count. Reason 11. Not enough sunlight. I want you to think back to when you planted that flower. Was it a small nursery pot tucked in front of a young tree, or near a fence line that seemed open and sunny at the time? Gardens change, trees grow taller, fences get new sections. A neighbor's addition casts a shadow that was not there 3 years ago, and suddenly, a spot that used to get 6 hours of sun barely gets 3. Most flowering perennials, including coneflowers, black-eyed Susan, daylilies, garden phlox, and lavender, need at least 6 hours of direct sunlight to produce flower buds. When shade creeps in gradually, the plant does not die. It simply redirects its energy into leafy growth instead of blooms, because leaves can survive on filtered light, while flowers require a much bigger energy investment. The telltale sign is a plant that looks perfectly healthy, full, green, and vigorous, but stretches slightly toward the light and produces buds that either never open or drop before they mature. If you press your hand to the soil at midday and it feels cool and shaded rather than warm, that is often your answer. The fix depends on how mobile your plant is. Perennials in containers can simply be moved to a sunnier spot. In-ground plantings can be dug up and relocated in early spring or fall when temperatures are mild. And most established perennials handle a move surprisingly well if you keep the roots moist afterward. If moving is not an option, thinning nearby branches to let in more light can make a real difference within a single season. Recovery time is usually fast here, often the very next blooming season, once adequate light returns. A common myth is that all shade-loving plants refuse to bloom entirely. That is not true. Plants like astilbe and certain hostas with flower spikes tolerate shade just fine. The issue only arises when a plant that genuinely needs full sun is gradually shaded out without anyone noticing. Reason 10. Too much nitrogen fertilizer. This one catches so many well-meaning gardeners off guard because it looks like the opposite of a problem. Your plant is thriving. It is fuller and greener than it has ever been. You feel like you finally figured out the secret. Then the bloom season rolls around, and there is nothing but leaves. The culprit is often a fertilizer that is high in nitrogen, the first number on that 3-digit fertilizer label. Nitrogen fuels leafy, vegetative growth, while phosphorus and potassium, the second and third numbers, support root development and flowering. A lawn fertilizer accidentally applied near flower beds, or a general-purpose plant food used too generously, can push a plant into growing lush foliage at the direct expense of blooms. Roses, salvia, and garden phlox are especially sensitive to this imbalance, often responding to excess nitrogen with dark, oversized leaves and few, if any, flower buds. The fix is switching to a fertilizer formulated for blooming plants, generally one with a lower first number and higher second and third numbers, and cutting back on frequency rather than assuming more feeding always helps. Recovery is usually quick once the imbalance is corrected, often within the same growing season as new growth emerges under better conditions. A persistent myth is that plants can never get too much fertilizer as long as it is watered in well. In reality, more is not better here, and many flowering plants actually perform best in soil that is only moderately fertile. Reason 9. Poor soil health. Soil is the part of gardening nobody sees, which is exactly why it gets ignored until something goes wrong. A flower bed that looked fantastic the year you planted it can quietly decline over a few seasons as the soil compacts, loses organic matter, or becomes imbalanced in pH, all without a single visible warning sign above ground. Peonies, delphinium, and clematis are particularly sensitive to soil quality, often producing healthy foliage in mediocre soil, but refusing to invest energy into flowers unless nutrient levels and soil structure are genuinely good. Compacted soil restricts root growth and oxygen, and roots that cannot expand cannot support the energy demands of blooming. Warning signs include soil that stays either bone dry or waterlogged for extended periods, a hard crust on the surface, or a noticeable decline in bloom size over several years, even though the plant itself looks otherwise fine. A simple test is pushing a screwdriver into the soil. If it takes real effort to get more than a couple of inches down, compaction is likely part of the story. The fix involves working in compost or well-aged organic matter around the root zone without disturbing the roots too aggressively, along with reducing foot traffic near the bed. A soil test from your local extension office can also reveal pH problems, since plants like hydrangeas and lavender have fairly specific pH preferences that affect nutrient availability. Recovery from poor soil is typically gradual, often taking a full season or two of amendment before bloom performance visibly improves, since soil structure changes slowly. A common myth is that adding more fertilizer can compensate for bad soil structure. It cannot. Fertilizer feeds the plant, but structure determines whether roots can actually access it. Reason 8. Watering mistakes. I watered it faithfully, every single week. That is one of the most common things gardeners say right before describing a plant that grew leaves but never flowered, and it usually reveals the actual problem. Consistency matters, but consistency in the wrong direction can be just as damaging as neglect. Both underwatering and overwatering interfere with blooming, just through different mechanisms. Drought stress causes a plant to abort flower buds early to conserve resources for basic survival, which is why you might see buds form and then shrivel before opening on plants like clematis or garden phlox during a dry spell. Overwatering, on the other hand, often leads to root rot, which limits the plant's ability to take up the nutrients needed to produce flowers at all. The visible signs differ slightly. Underwatered plants often show slightly wilted leaves during the hottest part of the day, even when the soil looks damp on the surface. Overwatered plants tend to have yellowing lower leaves and a soil that feels soggy, well below the surface, sometimes with a faint sour smell. The fix is checking soil moisture a few inches down rather than relying on the surface or a fixed schedule. Most flowering perennials prefer soil that dries out slightly between waterings rather than staying constantly damp. Improving drainage with raised beds or amended soil solves chronic overwatering issues, while deep, less frequent watering solves chronic underwatering far better than frequent shallow sprinkles. Plants generally bounce back within a single season once watering is corrected, assuming root rot has not progressed too far. A common myth is that daily watering is always safer than infrequent watering. In most garden soils, the opposite is true, since frequent shallow watering encourages shallow root systems that struggle in heat and rarely support strong blooming. Reason 7. Old wood versus new wood confusion. This deserves its own dedicated moment because it causes so much heartbreak, especially with hydrangeas. If you think that is frustrating, wait until you hear how many gardeners have sworn off growing hydrangeas entirely because of this single misunderstanding, when the plant was never actually the problem. Big leaf and oak leaf hydrangeas form their flower buds on the previous year's stems in late summer and fall. Those buds then overwinter, sometimes visibly, sometimes tucked in tightly, and open the following spring and summer. If a late frost damages those buds, or if the stems are cut back in fall cleanup, the plant simply has no buds left to open, even though the roots and crown are perfectly alive and healthy. The confusion multiplies because panicle hydrangeas and smooth hydrangeas bloom on new wood entirely, meaning they flower on growth produced that same spring, so cutting them back hard in late winter is not just safe, it often improves flowering by encouraging vigorous new stems. The fix starts with correctly identifying which type of hydrangea, or which type of any old wood-blooming shrub, you actually have. Once identified, old wood bloomers should only be pruned immediately after flowering finishes, and any fall cleanup should leave the stems intact through winter. If frost is a recurring issue in your climate, a loose layer of mulch or burlap around the base in late fall can protect the developing buds. Recovery is complete and usually happens the very next blooming cycle once the correct timing is restored. A widespread myth is that a hydrangea that fails to bloom for a season or two is dying. In almost every case, it is simply losing its buds to frost or pruning, and the plant itself remains perfectly healthy underground. Reason 6. Deadheading mistakes. Deadheading, the practice of removing spent flowers, sounds simple enough, but doing it incorrectly, or not at all, is a surprisingly common reason plants stop reblooming within a single season, and sometimes into the next one as well. Here is the biology behind it. Once a flower fades, the plant's natural next step is to funnel energy into producing seeds, which is a far more energy-intensive process than producing another flower. Removing the spent bloom before seed formation begins tricks many reblooming perennials, including coneflowers, salvia, and Shasta daisy, into producing another flush of blooms instead. The mistake usually shows up in one of two ways. Either gardeners skip deadheading entirely and let the plant go to seed early, cutting the blooming season short, or they deadhead incorrectly by snipping only the flower head and leaving a long bare stem behind, which can look untidy and occasionally slows the next flush. The fix is simple once you know the plant. For most repeat blooming perennials, cut the spent flower stem back to just above a set of healthy leaves or a side bud, rather than leaving a tall bare stalk. Some plants, like catmint and salvia, respond especially well to a harder shearing back by a third after the first big bloom, which often triggers a strong second flush within a few weeks. Recovery here is fast, frequently producing new buds within 2 to 4 weeks of proper deadheading. A common myth worth clearing up is that deadheading is necessary for every flowering plant. Many once-blooming perennials and some annuals, bred to be self-cleaning, do not need it at all, so it is worth checking your specific plant rather than assuming the same rule applies everywhere. Reason 5. Overcrowding and root competition. A garden bed that starts out with generous spacing between young plants can look sparse and almost embarrassing that first year. Fast forward 3 or 4 seasons, and that same bed is often a dense tangle where every root system is competing for the same limited water, nutrients, and light. Daylilies, garden phlox, bee balm, and coneflowers are particularly prone to this because they spread readily by rhizomes or self-seeding, gradually forming dense clumps that choke themselves out from the inside. As the clump thickens, individual stems get less light and nutrients, and bloom count often declines noticeably even as the overall plant mass appears to grow larger. The warning signs include a clump that looks impressively full but produces smaller or fewer flowers each year, along with weak, spindly stems in the center of the plant compared to the outer edges. If you part the foliage and see mostly bare, woody stems in the middle, overcrowding is very likely the cause. The fix is dividing the clump, typically every 3 to 4 years for most fast-spreading perennials. Dig up the entire clump in early spring or fall, gently separate it into smaller sections with a sharp spade or knife, and replant them with adequate spacing, usually keeping only the healthiest outer sections rather than the depleted center. Divided plants often skip blooming for the remainder of that first season while they re-establish roots, then return to full flowering the following year. A common myth is that dividing a plant weakens it permanently. In reality, regular division is one of the best things you can do for the long-term health and bloom performance of most spreading perennials. Reason 4. Container restrictions. This next mistake surprises even experienced gardeners, because it seems like container plants should be easier to manage, not harder. A pot gives you total control over soil, drainage, and placement. The trade-off is that the plant's roots eventually run out of room, and when that happens, blooming is usually the first thing to suffer. When roots fill a container completely, they begin circling around the inside edge, a condition commonly called being root-bound. At that point, the plant can no longer take up enough water and nutrients to support the demanding process of flowering, even though the top growth might still look reasonably healthy for a while. Roses, hydrangeas, and many perennials grown in containers are especially prone to this within just 2 or 3 years. The telltale sign is roots visibly emerging from the drainage holes, water running straight through the pot without being absorbed, or a plant that seems to need watering constantly compared to previous seasons. If you gently slide the plant out of its container and see a dense mat of roots circling the root ball, that confirms it. The fix is repotting into a larger container, gently teasing apart or lightly scoring the circling roots to encourage them to grow outward instead of continuing to spiral, and refreshing the potting mix at the same time, since it breaks down and loses structure over a couple of years, regardless of root crowding. Recovery typically shows up within 1 growing season after repotting, once the roots have room to expand again. A common myth is that a bigger pot immediately means bigger blooms. Sizing up too dramatically, several sizes at once, can actually lead to soggy soil and rot, so moving up gradually, 1 size at a time, works better for most flowering plants. Reason 3. Winter damage and improper dormancy. This hidden reason is far more common than most people realize, especially after an unusually harsh winter or a late spring cold snap. The plant survives, the roots are fine, but the flower buds themselves, which are often more cold-sensitive than the rest of the plant, do not make it through. Many shrubs, including big-leaf hydrangeas, some rose varieties, and even certain clematis, form their flower buds the previous fall, and those buds sit exposed through winter, waiting to open. A sudden hard freeze, an unusually cold winter for your region, or a late frost after buds have already begun to swell in early spring, can kill the buds outright while leaving the rest of the plant completely unharmed. The warning sign is a plant that leaves out normally in spring, looks entirely healthy, and then simply never produces flowers that year, sometimes accompanied by blackened or shriveled bud tips if you look closely at the stems in early spring before leaf out. The fix largely comes down to protection. In colder climates, wrapping vulnerable shrubs loosely with burlap, mulching heavily around the base, or choosing more cold-hardy cultivars bred specifically for reliable rebloom in harsher winters can prevent this from happening year after year. Waiting to remove winter protection until the danger of hard frost has passed also helps considerably. Recovery is typically immediate the following year once winter conditions cooperate or protection is improved, since the plant itself was never actually harmed. A persistent myth is that a plant needs to be replaced if it fails to bloom after a rough winter. In almost every case, patience and better winter protection solve the problem without any need to dig up a perfectly healthy plant. Reason 2. Wrong hardiness zone or immature plants. Sometimes the issue was decided before the plant ever went into the ground. Every flowering plant has a hardiness zone range it is bred to tolerate, and pushing a plant slightly outside that range, often because it looked beautiful at the garden center and the tag seemed close enough, sets up a struggle that shows up specifically as poor or absent blooming. Plants growing at the edge of their hardiness range often survive just fine, but spend so much energy simply coping with winter cold or summer heat that they have little left over for flowering. Delphinium, for example, struggles in hot, humid summers well outside its preferred range, often surviving, but rarely blooming reliably, while some lavender varieties fail to overwinter properly in climates that are colder or wetter than they tolerate. A closely related and often overlooked issue is plant maturity. Peonies, clematis, and many roses simply need time, sometimes 2 to 3 years, to establish a root system substantial enough to support flowering. A first-year peony that produces 1 or 2 small blooms and then seems to pause the following year is not failing. It is established. The fix for hardiness mismatches usually involves choosing cultivars bred specifically for your zone, or providing extra protection, such as winter mulch or afternoon shade in extreme summer heat. For immature plants, the fix is simply patience, paired with good basic care, since pushing a young plant with heavy fertilizer to force blooms often backfires and stresses the root system instead. Recovery timing depends heavily on which issue is at play, ranging from immediate improvement with a better-suited cultivar to a couple of full growing seasons for a young plant to mature into reliable blooming. A common myth is that a plant is defective if it does not bloom in its first year. For many perennials and flowering shrubs, that first quiet year is completely normal. Reason 1. Confusing once-blooming perennials with reblooming ones. The final reason catches thousands of gardeners every year, and it might be the most important one on this entire list, because it is not actually a mistake at all. It is a mismatched expectation. Many beloved flowering plants are naturally once-blooming perennials, meaning they are genetically programmed to produce exactly 1 flush of flowers per year, no matter how perfectly they are cared for. Peonies, bearded irises, tulips, daffodils, and wide classic lilac varieties fall into this category. Their single bloom period each spring or early summer is not a sign of a problem, it is simply how the plant is built. This gets confusing because the same garden often contains truly reblooming perennials planted right alongside once bloomers, plants like coneflowers, salvia, and many modern rose varieties that are bred to produce multiple flushes of flowers across an entire season with proper deadheading and care. When a once-blooming peony finishes its 2 or 3 glorious weeks, and a nearby coneflower keeps flowering into fall, it is easy to assume the peony did something wrong. The fix here is entirely about expectations rather than technique. Once you know a plant is naturally once blooming, you stop searching for a hidden mistake, and instead, plan your garden to include a mix of once blooming and reblooming species, so something is always in flower somewhere in the bed, even while the peonies rest for the year. There is no recovery needed here because there was never anything wrong. A remarkably common myth, one that fuels an enormous amount of unnecessary gardening anxiety, is the belief that a healthy flowering perennial should always rebloom repeatedly if it is cared for correctly. Many of the most treasured perennials in gardening, peonies especially, earn their reputation specifically because of that one spectacular, fleeting bloom, not in spite of it. A few additional causes round out the full picture, and each is worth knowing even in brief. Transplant stress can delay blooming for a full season, as a plant focuses entirely on root recovery rather than flowers, which is completely normal and resolves on its own with steady watering and patience. Poor drainage creates chronically soggy roots that struggle to support flowering and is fixed by amending heavy clay soil with organic matter or shifting plants to raised beds. Pest damage, particularly from aphids, thrips, or Japanese beetles feeding directly on developing buds, can be identified by chewed or misshapen buds and is managed with targeted, plant-safe treatments as soon as damage appears. Disease, including certain fungal infections that stress the plant systemically, can suppress blooming even when leaves look only mildly affected and usually requires improving air circulation along with appropriate treatment. Finally, planting depth matters more than most gardeners expect. Bulbs and crowns planted too deep or too shallow, particularly with peonies, which are famously sensitive to being planted even an inch too deep, can prevent flowering entirely while the rest of the plant grows normally for years. If you made it this far, you now know more about why flowers fail to rebloom than most people learn in a decade of trial and error in their own backyard. Every single one of these reasons has a real, identifiable cause, and every single one of them has a practical fix or, in the case of naturally once blooming plants, simply requires a shift in expectations rather than a change in care. The next time a plant blooms gloriously once and then seems to go quiet, resist the urge to assume the worst. Walk through the possibilities. Check the pruning timing, the sunlight, the fertilizer, the soil, the water, the crowding, the pot size, the winter protection, the hardiness zone, the plant's age, and finally, whether it was ever meant to rebloom in the first place. Somewhere in that list is almost always your answer. I would love to know which of these reasons matched what happened in your own garden, so tell me in the comments, and if this helped clear up a mystery you have been dealing with. A like and a subscribe helps this channel keep making videos exactly like this one. And if you have ever wondered why some flowers bloom continuously for months, while others put on a spectacular show for just a few weeks, and then vanish completely, that is a mystery worth its own video. We will uncover it together very soon.